Our gospel this morning comes from the Gospel of John, the 11th chapter, starting with the first verse. But once again, this is a very long gospel, so in keeping with Pastor Aaron's tradition, you may be seated. This is our continued gift to you. John chapter 11, the first verse. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. Here ends our gospel reading. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord. Amen. The passage we have today, although long, is a critical text, especially in light of faithfulness, which we have been talking about throughout Lent. I love the Lazarus text, but reading through it this week, in preparation for this morning, I found new things to think about. We see in this passage that Mary and Martha, who we met in previous chapters, their brother Lazarus is ill. They deliver a message to Jesus, and Jesus chooses to stay away an extra 2 days before traveling back to the town of Bethany. When Jesus finally arrives, it appears to be too late, or so the sisters think. Lazarus is dead and has been dead for 4 days. Jesus ends up raising Lazarus from the dead and performing one of his greatest miracles, perhaps a foretaste of Easter morning. This time, reading through the gospel text, the thing that stood out to me the most is the fact that Martha and then later Mary accuse Jesus. They rebuke him. They tell him in no uncertain terms that had he been there, they know that their brother wouldn't have died. They know who Jesus is. They have dined with him, spent time with him. Mary adorned him with perfume. They know exactly who Jesus is. And they also know that had he been there, no one needed to have died. Mary and Martha accuse Jesus of not showing up. But the key thing here is that Jesus did show up. Jesus is ever faithful. He never fails. His showing up may not always be when we think it should happen, but he still shows up. What I found comforting while reading through the text this time was Mary and Martha's accusations. I know there have been times in my life where I've accused God of something, and what I find to be helpful is some of Jesus' closest friends accuse him also of not showing up. So when I start to accuse God of whatever it is I think he has or hasn't done, I know that this isn't the first time people have been angry with him. I know that our God is big enough to handle our accusations, our anger. He knows they are coming, and he knows how to deal with it. My accusations, our accusations, aren't unexpected. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think God welcomes our anger, if only for him to remind us, like he does in this passage, that our timing is not his timing, that even in the midst of death, new life appears. But that doesn't make the pain any easier. After showing up and being accused of being too late, Jesus then asks Mary where they have laid him, and Mary breaks down and cries. And here's another key part of the text. Jesus is greatly disturbed by the depth of Mary's feelings, and this pain that he sees in Mary causes him to cry himself. Jesus is so moved by the grief Mary is feeling that it causes Jesus to weep. The King of the universe cries because of Mary's pain. The King of creation cries at our pain as well. When tough things happen, when we find ourselves in the middle of our own pain, we often accuse God of not doing enough, of not being here, of not stepping in and changing the outcome. Because like Mary, we know Jesus could do more. We know without a doubt that he could take away all the pain and all the suffering. We know who he is. But from this passage, we also see that Jesus isn't sitting idly by. He isn't letting the tough times happen. He is just as upset by our pain as we are. He weeps with us. He in no way wishes for us to go through pain and suffering. But because we live in a sinful and broken world, the bad things do happen. Cancer spreads, people die, tornadoes ravage land, loved ones move away. The things that cause us grief, the things that cause us to cry out and accuse God, are the very things that cause God to cry out on our behalf. After all, as we march closer and closer to Easter, on Good Friday, we see that Jesus cries out to God. He asks why God has forsaken him. We see the creator of the world not be able to witness his son's death on our behalf. The things that cause us grief also cause the maker of the world grief. But our passage doesn't end here. Jesus weeps with Mary, and then in the next breath cries out for Lazarus to come out of the tomb. Mary and Martha are confused. They know that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. They realize that there would be a stench, and one they didn't want to smell. But regardless, Jesus calls Lazarus forth from the tomb, and unsurprisingly, Lazarus awakens and comes out. The man who turned water into wine, healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, calmed the storms, he raises the dead. Jesus of Nazareth's final miracle in the Gospel of John before the crucifixion and resurrection is to raise Lazarus, a hint of that first Easter morning. So what then can we gather about God's faithfulness to his people from this passage? Actually, quite a bit. The biggest thing being that God is so very faithful, even when it feels like he isn't. God never, ever wavers in his faithfulness to his creation. Martha and Mary sent Jesus a letter, assuming he would come at their call. They're friends, after all. And when he didn't show up, my hunch is that they were pretty disappointed. I mean, they accuse him of not showing up. To them, Jesus had let them down. The quickest way to be unfaithful is to waver in your devotion, because faithfulness is about showing up, being there, holding steady. And Jesus didn't come when called. I can imagine how disappointed in the middle of their grief Mary and Martha were. They trusted Jesus. I have felt that disappointment that Mary and Martha felt, that if God would have shown up, if God would have answered my prayers how I think they needed to be answered, the bad thing wouldn't have happened. And I am sure you have felt that way too. But the good news in the middle of this is twofold. One, God does show up, not always how we expect, but he's there. And two, when the bad things do happen, God weeps with us. When unforetold tragedy strikes, God is there weeping right beside us. He hates the evil in the world as much as we do, and it causes him pain just like it causes us pain, and he cries with us. Jesus wept at the tomb of his friend. This God, who is fully human, broke down and wept. I imagine not just a tear or two, but a full-on weep, the sounds of a heart breaking. Years ago, I was sitting in my living room watching who knows what, and it was something that was causing me to cry. Doesn't take much. But after I surprisingly felt better, I learned that crying is cathartic. It heals our souls one tear at a time. That's why we cry when we grieve, when we're sad, and even when we're angry. Crying is a way that helps us heal. As I imagine Jesus weeping at Lazarus' tomb, I imagine it to be this type of crying, the crying that heals a person's soul one tear at a time, the weeping that you can't control, because Jesus knew what death was. He knew what that meant, and he was moved by it. But the man that was also fully God knew that this wasn't the end of Lazarus' story. He knew that within minutes, Lazarus would be walking out of the tomb alive, breathing, heart pumping, but that didn't stop the pain in the moments previous. I can't really imagine what it was like for Jesus, being both fully human and fully God. As a human, Jesus knew what it was like to be us, to be tied to emotion, tied to the world around us, interacting with a broken and sinful humanity. But as God, Jesus knew what it was to create the stars, to whisper into the wind, and to know everything past, present, and future. I am thankful for my humanness, for my inability to see the future, for my ability to, most days, learn from my past, and for the gift of living in the present, because I don't really want the power or struggle that Jesus must have felt. To know that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, but also knowing he was dead, that he would have had both of those thoughts running through his mind. For me, it is hard enough being human. I can't imagine being God and human at the same time. But that is what we have in Jesus. We see someone who is clearly human, although he makes way less mistakes than we do, yet someone who is God, and this passage shows this very clearly. To me, there is nothing that proves Jesus knows what it is to be human more than this passage. He was fully human, and we don't always focus on this human side. But in this text from John, we see Jesus weeping at his friend's tomb. But then, in a way only Jesus can, he calls forth Lazarus from the dead and outwalks his friend, a foretaste of Easter. The God who created the universe, who is moved with compassion, and who weeps with his creation, is the God who loves to bring new life out of death. Rest in the comfort knowing that we worship a God of empty tombs. Amen.